Here's a question for you. If you had to spend $50,000 on a product, would you rather buy that from me, or would you rather spend that money with me? So listen, today I want to talk about a really touchy subject, and this is on dress and deportment, but more importantly, the underlying bias that every human exhibits. The fact is we are biased, and how you can either let that bias take control of the situation or how you can use it to your advantage. So if you're someone who interacts with customers on a day-to-day basis, or maybe if you're just a job seeker looking to land that next role, this video is for you. So if I look at my life, there's been a bunch of compelling events that have led me to be who I am today. And I can even name the few that have led me to dressing how I do today. And let's be clear, what you're seeing here is a version of me that I'm choosing to present to you. And in the sales world, how I like to refer to this is being a chameleon. As a salesperson, you're going to find yourself in many different types of customer environments. And how you choose to present yourself will impact whether you thrive or die in those environments. Now I want to start today by telling a story about the stupidest thing I ever did in sales. I once got on a prospect discovery call with the #1 company in my total addressable market by revenue size, by a massive margin, dressed like a piece of bacon. Now here's some context. It was Halloween, and the 3 people who were going to be attending the call were myself, another senior sales leader, and the CEO of our company. The CEO told me to get on that call in costume. I will spare you the details, but as you can probably imagine, after that call, the customer ghosted us. And I don't know why any part of me thought that outcome was going to be different. And as much as I knew better, there was a part of me that said it shouldn't matter how me or the rest of my team's dressed on this call. We're a fun company, it's Halloween, and let's show the customer that we've got some personalities. Needless to say, that was the first and last call we ever had with that customer. Now you might be saying to yourself, Halloween costumes? Sure, that's a little obnoxious, but the principle is still the same. People, no matter how hard they try not to, will exhibit bias. And as I said earlier, we can either allow that bias to control the situation, or we can acknowledge it, understand it, and use it to our advantage. And this plays back to the example I had at the beginning of the video. Take someone who's dressed in a hoodie and a baseball cap. Now take someone dressed in a nicer outfit. Make everything else in that deal equal. The products have the same capabilities. The price points are the same. What becomes the only differentiating factor? You. Now, if you acknowledge to yourself early that the person on the other end of the call holds an unconscious bias, you can play into that. And while this might sound all nefarious and manipulative, this is a core principle of human interaction. Now, I'm going to give you a real-life example of how this happened to me as a customer. Not too long ago, I was responsible for evaluating security and compliance tools. I took the typical buyer journey, I did a bunch of research on my own, and narrowed my list down to a couple companies. And on the surface, these 2 products looked nearly identical, and their price points were nearly identical as well. So I booked demos with both of those companies. The first call I had is what I like to say has become common practice within a ton of startups. The sales rep jumped on the call with me. He was dressed in a black hoodie with the company's logo on the left side. He was wearing a baseball cap, and he was in a plain white room with the door behind him. He was also working on a laptop on a lower desk, which caused him to be hunched forward and leaning over the camera into the call. Many of you are picturing what this looks like right now, and perhaps sitting at your own computer with exactly the same setup. And why this became such a common layout was because when everyone started working remotely during the pandemic, people didn't have dedicated office space in their house. They typically had to use a spare bedroom or their own bedroom, and their space really wasn't set up with any ergonomics in mind. So they put the laptop on a desk or a table, and they pull a chair up to it. And because you started seeing this over and over and over again, the more and more calls you had with folks, the setup became somewhat normalized. Hey, I love not wearing pants to work as much as the next person. And so half an hour later, our call's over. The rep did a great job answering any of my questions and really framing his product in a very positive light. So now let's fast forward to the call with the other company. When I jump on this call, the sales rep on the other end of the call is wearing a tailored suit. He's sitting upright with his shoulders back, and he's in a purpose-built office space within his home. The scene feels very natural. As we get to the end of the call, the rep's answered all of my questions. He's been very articulate, and I hang up. And I have already unconsciously made the decision of which vendor I'm about to choose. Now you might say, as a buyer, it's my responsibility to be unbiased. I really should just be looking at all the factual information in front of me to make my decision, but I'm not going to. I had to give one of those 2 reps $30,000. And this is where my bias takes over. I appreciate that the other rep took the time to present themselves as professionally as possible. And that reflected very well on me. all other areas being equal. And that rep has now become the differentiating factor in their company securing my business. And you're right, as a buyer, I should just use the information presented in front of me. But when there's no clear differentiator, my bias is going to win. The fact is, we are biased. Now, there are many types of unconscious bias, but one of the most common is affinity bias. And what I find fascinating is that when people are trying to improve and remove unconscious bias from their life, they almost completely ignore affinity bias. So the principle is simple. Affinity bias implies that we want to surround ourselves with people who have similar interests, similar backgrounds, or perhaps a similar taste in clothing. And if you think about your group of friends, you likely have groups of friends who like the same types of music, maybe the same types of sports, and you've created these affinity groups. Now, talking about how we can capitalize on affinity bias in order to drive better rapport with customers is an entirely separate topic. And some of you are probably considering right now that as a customer, I was displaying an affinity bias towards the rep who was more well-dressed, because I myself like a well put together outfit. But I'm actually going to stop short of saying that's an affinity bias. What I would instead say is this more accurately represents a halo effect. And this term got coined by a psychologist in the 1920s named Edward Thorndike. And what it means is we'll sometimes develop a positive impression of someone or something due to a single quality or trait. And in this case, the company and the product are receiving the halo benefit of the sales rep showing a high level of professionalism in their dress and deportment. Something I said earlier that I work with reps on is learning to be a chameleon. Are you going to thrive or die in the environment you're going into? And sometimes that's entirely dependent on how you choose to present yourself. For instance, when I get on a call with technical subject matter experts, I'm usually dressing down a little to be more relatable. And when I'm getting into a meeting with a senior executive, I'm wearing a custom tailored 5-piece suit. Read the room. Read the room. Read the room. Read the room. Learn to be a chameleon. Chameleon. The thing you should ask yourself is, am I welcome at this table? So when I'm about to go into one of these customer meetings, which is a completely foreign environment for me, how can I determine that bias ahead of time? Sometimes it's easy. If your customer is very social media savvy, it can be really easy to learn and read your prospect. But for those folks that are closed books and research isn't going to get you anywhere, the advice I typically give reps: dress like your customer is more important than they think they are, and that they deserve the best version of you. You'll be hard pressed to find anyone who said, I lost that deal because I was dressed too well. And when we bring it back to the fundamental principle, when everything else is equal and you have become the differentiator, what are you going to wear to work?